What does power look like? For nearly 1,000 years, the civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean wrestled with the same question, and as they did, they left behind some of the most monumental works of art ever created. Welcome back to You, Me, and Art. I'm your host, Mora Arceorneche, and on today's episode of the A Pure History series, we're looking at many of those artworks which were made to show power as we finish off Content Area 2, the Ancient Mediterranean. We're picking up right where we left off and making our way over to the rise and fall of Rome. That's a lot of ground to cover, so let's get into it. First, a little context. The First Persian Empire was, at its height, the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. Under Darius and Xerxes, it controlled 23 subject nations, and that's important to keep in mind as we dive in to our first artwork. At this point, Persia was the superpower of the ancient world. So how do you control an empire that enormous? Well, you build Persepolis. Persepolis was the ceremonial capital and founded by Darius the Great in 518 BCE on a massive terrace platform covering 125,000 square meters. At the center of Persepolis was the Apadana, the great audience hall where representatives from all 23 subject nations came to deliver tribute to the Persian king. The hall itself is hypostyle, meaning the roof was supported by columns, and originally 72 columns were standing 80 feet high, topped with capitals. These capitals might have been double-headed bulls, eagles, or lions, and these are all examples of animals which represent royal power and kingship. Now, only 13 columns are still standing today. The rest is gone. Then there are north and east staircases. Each stairway are covered in relief sculptures throwing delegates from the 23 subject nations walking calmly up towards the enthroned king, dressed in clothing which helps to identify their homeland and where they're from. They're all bringing gifts such as textiles, animals, and vessels to give to the king. So the Persians showed their power through order and organization beneath the authority of the king. All of this stood tall until Alexander the Great burned Persepolis to the ground in 330 BCE. Yet whether it was intentional or a drunken accident is still debated today. Now, while Persia was building one of the largest empires, smaller cultures around the Mediterranean were developing very different artistic traditions. In Greece, artists were becoming obsessed with ideal beauty and human proportion, and in Italy, the Etruscans were building colorful temples and tombs. Now, let's zoom in on the Etruscans for a minute. The Etruscans are one of the civilizations that history has somewhat swallowed up, largely because the Romans, who eventually conquered them, absorbed most of their culture. Etruscan temples were colorful, theatrical, and very frontal and forward. They were built from wood, mud brick, tufa, and terracotta. Remember the terracotta from the last episode? Most have vanished over entirely, which is why we reconstruct them from the writings of a Roman architect named Vitruvius, who documented Etruscan temple design in his Treatise de Architectura in the 1st century BCE. The Temple of Minerva stood on a podium with a deep front porch and a dramatic entrance. Unlike Greek temples that invited you to walk all the way around them, Etruscan temples had one direction, which was forward. They also had Etruscan columns, which are called Doric, with a base and 3 back rooms called a tripicella. Now, this temple comes with sculpture, which, surprisingly enough, is found on the roof, not inside. Now, for a second, imagine how this would have seemed if you were an Etruscan walking up to this temple at this time. You would have been walking around Italy, and you would have seen the silhouette of a largely painted sculpture standing there against the sky. The most famous surviving figure is the Apollo of Veii. He's striding forward with patterned drapery, stylized hair, and that classic archaic smile. He's mid-pursuit of Hercules in a mythological battle over the golden hide, a deer sacred to Artemis. Also, as we progress through A Pure history, we know more and more about the artists' names. In this case, it's Vulca of Veii. The Roman writer Pliny records that Vulca was so skilled, he was summoned to decorate the temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, and Rome. Now, this is the name of the temple dedicated to the Capitoline Triad, the 3 major Roman deities. Jupiter, king of the gods, Juno, goddess of marriage, and Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. And inside this large temple, Minerva had her own dedicated room and cella, which is what our artwork is looking at. All right, the Tomb of the Triclinium is a painted underground chamber tomb. You enter through a narrow passageway called a dromos, which gives the whole experience a theatrical quality, which I mentioned about the Etruscans before. Inside, there's a single chamber, which is covered wall to wall in fresco paint applied directly onto wet plaster. The name of the tomb comes from the triclinium, the three-couch dining room used in elite Greco-Roman meals. And that's what you see on the rear wall. Couples are reclined together at a banquet and they are eating, drinking, and being attended by servants. The ceiling used a checkerboard pattern of alternating colors, probably imitating the fabric canopies set up outside tombs during actual funeral celebrations. On the side walls, there are dancers and musicians, and a male musician plays the barbiton, which is a stringed instrument similar to a lyre. And following ancient painting conventions, male skin is painted darker in tone and female skin is painted lighter, a gender coding system used across Mediterranean cultures, and it also showed how men were outside working and hit by the sun while women stayed at home. The style shows clear influence from Greek red figure pottery, which Etruscans actively imported from Athens. Now, this is funerary art, but unlike Egypt's focus on eternal judgment and divine order, the Etruscans imagined the afterlife as a continuation. The feast keeps going into the afterlife. In the funeral, the entire procession was meant to comfort you and also remind the community of the family's status. From the Etruscans, we cross into Greece. Greece in the 5th century BCE was a collection of competing city-states. Each had its own government, army, and national identity. The most powerful was Athens. The period we're entering now is the classical period, which is roughly 480 to 323 BCE. And it's all about democracy and philosophy. Here we have a crater, specifically a calyx crater, which is a large ceramic vessel used to mix wine and water at elite drinking parties called symposia. The Greeks diluted their wine because it was very strong, which is very responsible of them, I might say. The vase is attributed to the Niobe painter, named for the myth on the back. Niobe was a mortal woman, and she bragged about her 14 children and how they were the most numerous and most beautiful than the children of the goddess Leto. Now, this was a horrible mistake. Leto's children happened to be Apollo and Artemis, god of sun and music and goddess of the hunt, respectively. Together, they killed all 14 of Niobe's children with arrows. The lesson is not to brag. Now, the figures still carry a lot of stiffness, even though we're entering the classical period, because this is the severe period. It's a transition moment between the rigid, archaic period and the fluid classical period that we're heading towards. But what makes this vase specifically revolutionary is how it's laid spatially. Earlier Greek vase painting placed all the figures on a single flat ground line, and everyone was standing on the same floor in the same plane. The Niobe painter broke that rule, and the figures stand at different heights. They overlap naturally, and it's a lot more dynamic as well. Now, the other side of this artwork shows the hero Hercules, surrounded by reclining warriors, possibly depicting soldiers asking a statue of Hercules for protection before the Battle of Marathon. Art historians believe both compositions were influenced by lost Greek wall paintings, possibly Polygnotos, who was the first artist to paint figures in depth. But these lost Greek wall paintings are lost. And so the Niobe crater might be our last glimpse into what these would look like. Now, I know I say this a lot, but this is really the sculpture that changes everything. Polygnotos was trying to mathematically define beauty, and he wrote the treatise called the Canon, laying out the ideal human proportions as a formula. Now, this sculpture is proof of this concept that he created. If you look at how he stands, he has his weight on one leg, and the other is slightly bent. One arm once held the spear, and now it's lost, and his shoulders and hips tilt in opposite directions. This is contrapposto, which is counterpose. It's fluid. It's moving. And the body is rotating naturally around its own axis, which is creating a sense of life and movement. It replaced the stiff frontal stance of archaic sculpture and became the default pose for the idealized human figures for centuries. Even Michelangelo's David is another example of contrapposto. And it all starts here. What we have today is a Roman marble copy, while the original was bronze and it is now lost. We have another mega artwork here. Now, this is the star of the Acropolis. Remember the Athenian Agora in the last video? Well, the Parthenon sits at the top of the Acropolis where the Pantheonic procession led up to. For a little bit of context, the Persians had invaded and destroyed the earlier temples on the Acropolis during the Persian Wars. The Athenians swore they'd leave the ruins untouched forever as a reminder of this horrible encounter. Then Pericles came along and wanted to build something bigger. Using funds from the Delian League, which is an alliance of Greek city-states whose tribute money originally meant to defend against Persia, Pericles launched one of the most ambitious building campaigns. At the center of this entire renovation and campaign was the Parthenon. So the entire temple honored Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. The city is named after her. The myth goes that Athena and Poseidon competed for the city's patronage, and they competed to see who could provide the better gift. Poseidon went first, and he struck the ground and produced a saltwater spring. Athena created an olive tree. This olive tree provided sustainable food, oil, and wood for the Athenians, and it was a practical and sustaining gift, which was chosen over Poseidon's impressive but useless spring. And there you have it. Athena was given patronage, and Athens was named after her. Now, this temple is in her honor. The building is Doric, with 8 columns across the front and 7 along the sides, and they are all marble. And something that you might not know is that nothing in the Parthenon is actually straight. The columns use entitas, which is a subtle outward bulge which corrects the optical illusion that perfectly straight columns appear weak or sunken. So if the columns were perfectly straight, they would actually not look straight. They would look weak, but entitas gives it this bulge which makes it look straight even though it's not actually perfectly straight. The stylobate, which is the base platform, curves upwards at the center by less than half an inch across the entire length, and the columns lean very slightly inward. Now that is either genius or incredibly obsessive. Probably a little bit of both. The entire building was covered in sculpture. The metopes, which are rectangular panels between the beam ends, depict Greeks battling centaurs, Amazons, Trojans, and giants. The pediments, which are the triangular gable ends, showed Athena's birth and her contest with Poseidon, which I had just touched on. And running all the way around the interior was the Ionic frieze. It's unusual on a Doric temple, but it's likely depicting the Pantheonic procession. Inside the Parthenon stood an enormous gold and ivory statue of Athena by Phidias, which is nearly 40 feet tall, and it no longer exists. The building survived for almost 2,000 years and had many roles. It was used as a Greek Orthodox church, a Roman Catholic church, and a mosque. 1687, the Ottomans stored gunpowder inside during the war with Venice, and a Venetian cannonball hit it, and the explosion blew out the center of the building. And then, to really pile on to all of this, in the early 1800s, Lord Elgin removed many of the remaining sculptures and shipped them to England, and they are now in the British Museum. Greece has demanded their return for decades, and that conversation is still ongoing. I want to specifically call out one fragment of the Parthenon frieze. It shows a group of young women, likely girls selected every 4 years, to weave a new ceremonial robe for the cult statue of Athena, which is a statue which moves in the procession up to the Acropolis. Now, what's remarkable is how the sculpture handled shallow space. Figures layer behind one another in the relief only a few inches deep, yet it reads as almost 3-dimensional. It looks like it's clinging onto the girls and revealing the bodies beneath as if the cloak were soaked through with water. And this is a signature technique of classical Greek sculpture, and a very good example of it is this next part of this entire artwork, which is Nike adjusting her sandal. Just off the Parthenon sits a smaller temple, the Temple of Athena Nike. Nike means victory. Yes, like the brand. And Athena Nike means Athena is the bringer of victory. And this fragment comes from the balustrade surrounding that temple. Nike is leaning forward, reaching down to adjust her sandal, and wings spread behind her. The wet drapery here is practically transparent, which takes a lot of skill, and this is what the classical style could do. It finds something profound in what looks ordinary. It could be a woman or a goddess adjusting her sandal, but really it captivates you and draws you in. Here's another example of a stele, just like the one that we looked at in global prehistory, but very different this time. A stele, in its own right, is an upright carved slab used as a grave marker, and this one was found in Kerameikos Cemetery, just outside the city gates of Athens. It shows a woman named Hegesso seated in a finely carved chair, opening a jewelry box presented to her by her servant. She appears to be examining a necklace, once painted but now faded away. The inscription above reads, Hegesso, daughter of Proxenos. We almost know nothing about Hegesso herself beyond those few words, and the relief dates to about 410 to 400 BCE. It was likely commissioned by her wealthy family after her death. The jewelry she examines might allude to her dowry, which is the money, property, clothing, jewelry, and goods that a woman's family provides to her husband when she gets married. And we don't know how Hegesso died, but because she appears to be a young woman, some scholars suggest that she may have died in childbirth, which is one of the most common causes of death for women in the ancient Greek world. But there's no evidence for that. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, at 32 years old, the world he conquered was divided among his generals. Greek culture spread across an enormous territory, from Egypt to the edges of India, and Greek art changed with it. The Hellenistic period runs from Alexander's death to the Roman conquest of Greece around 31 BCE. The restraint and harmony of the classical ideal gives way to something more expressive, more emotional, and more dramatic in the Hellenistic period. Standing at 18 feet tall, including the stone ship she stands on, Winged Victory was originally placed in the sanctuary of the Greek gods on the island of Samothrace, likely as a votive offering commemorating a naval victory. Found in pieces and carefully reconstructed, today she stands on top of a grand staircase in the Louvre. She was probably positioned to face the sea wind directly, possibly beside a fountain, and may once have held a trumpet or simply had one arm outstretched. What makes her so distinctly Hellenistic is the tension. Her lower body is pulled downward, and she's alighting on the ship prow, but her torso is twisted upward. There are two directions at once. Scholars believe the actual sea wind would have interacted with the sculpture as it stood there. We are on Pergamon, a hilltop kingdom on the coast of what is now Turkey, founded after Alexander the Great's death by one of his generals. And this is a perfect encapsulation of all that Hellenistic chaos. The great altar of Zeus and Athena features a massive high-relief frieze, nearly 400 feet long, depicting the Gigantomony, the mythological battle between the Olympian gods and the giants. Now, on the surface, there is this mythology, but really there's a lot of propaganda going on here. The kings of Pergamon were casting themselves as the defenders of the Greek civilization against chaos. Their military victories over neighboring peoples were symbolized by these gods defeating the giants. In this way, they were the gods. We have the Athena panel, which is where she grabs the giant Asinotus by the hair, pulling him from the earth where he draws his strength. His mother watches helplessly from the side, completely unable to intervene. Behind Athena is a winged Nike, reaching out to crown her. Zeus is on his panel, and he battles three giants simultaneously with thunderbolts. The altar now sits reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Reparation discussions continue. Rome was obsessed with Greek art. They collected it, they copied it, they hired Greek artists, and they even claimed parts of Greek heritage as their own. But Rome also developed a completely distinct visual identity, particularly when it comes to portraiture and architecture. For a quick timeline, Rome began as a republic, roughly 509 to 27 BCE, and they were governed by the Senate. Then it transitioned to an empire under Augustus, which lasted until the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE. Now, across all these periods, the art changes dramatically to reflect the environment. So in 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii under volcanic ash. It was catastrophic for the people of Pompeii, but the ash preserved the city exactly as it was on that day. The House of the Vedi belonged to two brothers, which were formerly enslaved men who had risen to wealth and civic prominence. One of the brothers held the highest civic position available to a freed person. They were self-made men, and they decorated their house to reflect this new wealth that they'd acquired. The layout follows classic Vitruvian plan. A narrow entrance leads into a large central atrium with an impluvium, which is a shallow stone basin collecting rainwater at the center. The wings are called alae, which flank on either side. Beyond lays the peristyle, which is an open colonnade garden courtyard. And there's a small multi-purpose room called a cubicula, which is open off the atrium. Two large strong boxes sat prominently in the atrium, and they were right where guests would see them. Now, this was a very big sign of wealth. The wall paintings are fourth-style frescoes, and one dining room features small winged gods called erodes, engaged in various occupations like chariot racing, making wine, working as goldsmiths, etc. The house was in the process of being repainted when Vesuvius hit, and it's frozen in mid-renovation 2,000 years ago. Still in Pompeii, we have a floor decoration. The Alexander mosaic was found between two open courtyards in the largest and most lavish house in Pompeii, the House of the Faun, named after a small bronze dancing satyr found there. The mosaic is made from roughly 1.5 million tiny pieces of stone and glass called tesserae. Now, the scene is Alexander the Great charging forward on his horse versus the Persian king Darius III. The momentum has already reversed. In this exact moment, you can see that the battle is turning, and it's in Alexander's favor. There is a dying Persian soldier's reflection appearing in Alexander's own upturned shield. And the mosaic was most certainly copied from a lost Greek wall painting. The foreshortening of horses and figures, which is the modeling of bodies with light and shadow, is what Greek painting excelled at. And almost none of it survives, which is why this floor mosaic might be our best bet of what that looks like. One of my favorite artworks in this entire content area, seated boxer. The seated boxer is exhausted. His torso collapsed forward. His head is turned to one side, and he's either looking at someone or maybe he's just looking at nothing and just looking out. I've actually seen this sculpture in person, and it feels very intimate. It almost feels like you're interrupting something private. It has a broken nose and a swollen cauliflower ear. Copper inlays, which is a different metal from bronze, create the appearance of fresh cuts and blood across his cheeks. His hands are wrapped in cetus, the ancient boxing glove, which is also braided leather. Most of the ancient bronze sculptures were melted down and reused over a century because bronze is expensive and reusable. So the fact that this is still standing today is very rare. Now, this one was found buried near a Roman public bath, and it was probably hidden intentionally. Lost wax casting allowed sculptures to achieve details like the chaste lines of his hair and his beard and the hollowed eyes, which once held either ivory or glass. The Hellenistic world cared about a wider range of human experiences than classical Greece did. It encapsulated age, defeat, suffering, but also survival. And the boxer is a perfect example of that. Remember how I said that there were different periods in Rome? So now we're in Republican Rome, 1st century BCE. This is verism, from the Latin veris, meaning truth. Veristic portraiture is a kind of hyperrealism where the natural signs of age are exaggerated. There are deep wrinkles, sagging jowls, there's a hooked nose, sunken cheeks. It's everything classical Greece spent centuries smoothing away and trying to keep perfect. Rome actually leans into it and embraces it completely. The reason that this is done is because in Republican Rome, age was correlated with virtue. So the fact that you would experience life meant that you had more authority and wisdom. So the tradition of imagines, which are wax death masks of notable ancestors, was something that was embedded in aristocratic life. These masks were worn by actors at family funerals. Veristic portraiture grew directly from this tradition. Yet, the question that I asked in the beginning of the episode, what does power look like? Well, to the Republican Romans, it looked like age and wisdom. Now, Augustus changes everything. After decades of civil war following Julius Caesar's assassination, Augustus becomes Rome's first emperor. He officially claimed to be restoring the Republic. And this sculpture is propaganda. It is a marble copy of an original bronze made around 19 BCE, and it's celebrating Augustus's diplomatic victory over the Parthians, who had captured Roman military standards in the earlier humiliating defeat. Augustus stands in contrapposto, remember that from Polykleitos, and his right arm is raised in the pose of a general addressing his troops. His faith is youthful, idealized, and this is important because he was considerably older when this was made, so it was intentional that he looked youthful. And this was unlike the aged gravitas of the Republic. And at his feet is a small Cupid who rides a dolphin, which links to Augustus's lineage back to the goddess Venus, and through her to the gods. So in this way, Augustus is giving himself divine origin. His cuirass, which is the armored breastplate, is a relief sculpture, Parthenon returning captured standards at the center. His victory is depicted. Now we have Apollo and Diana depicted along with this victory. So in this way, he is almost saying that this victory was divinely ordained. And Augustus is also barefoot, which is associated with divinity. So that's another symbol that is giving him authority. The Colosseum, formerly the Flavian Amphitheater, was built by Emperor Vespasian on the site of Nero's private artificial lake. Nero had been enormously unpopular. He had seized 100 to 150 acres of prime city center land for his own palace complex. Vespasian gave it back by building this massive public entertainment venue on top of it. And it was funded by spoils taken from Jerusalem after the Roman suppression of the Jewish revolt. The structure held about 50,000 spectators, organized by social class. The senators and priests were closest to the floor and closest to the spectacle. Behind them, the wealthy merchants, and above them, the common people. At the very top, on temporary wooden seats, were foreigners, slaves, and women. The exteriors stacked 3 Greek architectural orders: Doric at the bottom, Ionic above, and Corinthian at the top. This is Greek architecture in Rome. So in this way, Rome is saying that they inherited all of that. And underneath the arena lay the hypogeum, which is a underground system of corridors, cages, and elevators which were operated by slaves and used to send animals, gladiators, and scenery up through trap doors into the arena floor above. As for the entertainment, as they saw, in the morning there were animal hunts, in the midday there were public executions, and in the afternoon there was gladiatorial combat, which was all attended by 50,000 people, some of them even eating lunch during this. All of this allowed for the people to be happy and entertained so that the empire could stay stable. So the Colosseum is showing Roman entertainment. Now the Forum of Trajan represents Roman administration and Roman ego. Emperor Trajan hired the architect Apollodorus of Damascus to build it. The problem was there was no space left, so Apollodorus just removed a hill. The column of Trajan at the Forum's center marks exactly how tall that hill was, 125 feet. The Forum was enormous. There were markets and 2 libraries, one for Greek texts and one for Latin, and they were positioned so readers could look out and see the column from their reading porches. The massive Basilica Ulpia, which is a multi-purpose civic hall, there are open courtyards filled with sculptures of captured Dacians from modern Romania, whose defeat funded the entire complex. Now, there are coffered ceilings to reduce structural weight while creating this visual rhythm. For the column of Trajan, it's a spiraling relief frieze, which winds upwards 23 times, depicting Trajan's two Dacian campaigns in lots of detail. And inside the column is hollow, but there's a spiral staircase, and Trajan's ashes were actually deposited at the base. A gilded statue of Trajan once stood at the top, and now it's replaced in the 16th century by St. Peter. Trajan died before completing his planned temple, and Hadrian finished it, dedicating it to Trajan. So even dead, he still conveyed his power. The Pantheon is the best preserved ancient Roman building in existence, and it has been in continuous use since it was built. Originally a temple to all the gods under Emperor Hadrian, it became a Christian church in 609 CE and is still a functioning church to this day. Two popes are actually buried here, and so is Raphael. From the outside, it looks like a conventional temple. There is a deep porch of massive monolithic granite columns imported from Egypt and a triangular pediment. Although to us, it is clearly grander, this was actually pretty typical and boring at the time. And that was on purpose so that you would be surprised when you walked through the bronze doors. The space opens to a perfect sphere. The interior dome is exactly wide as it is tall, which is 43.3 meters in both directions. The dome is Roman concrete, which, unlike modern concrete, hasn't cracked in nearly 2,000 years. It was poured in layers of decreasing density, rising towards the top, using pumice and lighter materials near the crown to reduce weight. The coffers, recessed panels carved into the dome, remove additional mass while creating that rhythm, once again, like we've seen in previous artworks. At the very center of the dome is the oculus, which is a circular opening of 27 feet across. And when it rains, the floor gets wet. There's no glass. It drains through small holes in the slightly curved marble floor. And as the sun moves across the sky, a sharp circle of light sweeps across the dome and the walls. The building almost functions like a sundial, which makes the movements of the heavens visible on Earth. And there are 7 deep niches, which are alternating around the walls and originally held statues of the gods. The walls are lined in colored marble from across the empire. Now, once you know what was made up of the Pantheon, you'll start to see it in a lot of architecture that we're going to talk about later in this series. It was a lot came and was derived from the Pantheon. Okay, last artwork of this content area, the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. So by the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was under serious strain. They had been through civil war and political instability, and this art is reflectional of the chaos of the time. Ludovisi battle sarcophagus is a massive carved marble coffin depicting a battle between Romans and what appears to be Goths. The surface is packed and dense, and there's almost no breathing room between the individuals carved. Bodies are piled on piled. There are horses, there are shields, there are limbs and faces, and it's kind of impossible to find where one figure ends and the next begins. There's an intense contrast between light and shadow. And at the top center is the Roman general. And now he looks calm. The Goths have wild expressions, and the Romans are rendered more smoothly. And so even in this composition, the Romans wanted to make sure that they looked better than their enemies. The figures at the bottom are smaller than those at the top. And this is an inverted perspective, and it was created to evoke a dreamlike, disoriented quality. Sarcophagus also marks a shift in Roman burial practices because it is a sarcophagus in the end. Earlier, Romans cremated their dead, but by the 2nd century, burial in a sarcophagus had become fashionable, and it had given wealthy families a monumental sculptural surface to tell their story on and to be remembered by. The Roman Empire is beginning to feel very unstable, and the confident marble and the calm of Augustus of Prima Porta is a completely different world, and that was only 2 centuries ago. That's a wrap on ancient Mediterranean. We've traveled nearly 1,000 years of art shaped by religion, politics, empire, and war. Next time, we move over to content area 3, early Europe and colonial Americas. Now here, empires are collapsing and religions are rising. The medieval world is finally beginning. I'm Mora Arciarneche, and this has been You, Me, and Art. See you next time.